Okay, let's look at some of the relevant data that I have in mind. And for the exact numbers, I'm going to refer you to the website homelessinmarin.org because that's always changing and new information is always coming in. But we can look at some of the basic numbers here. So we have an official homeless count put out by, I think, HUD of 500,000 or 600,000 Americans who are homeless. Then we have an often cited 2 to 3 million homeless Americans. Then we have a 1 in 30 children who are homeless, minors who have, left home and are unaccompanied. And then we have 2.5 million children who are estimated to be homeless in addition to the 2 to 3 million Americans. So it's not entirely clear how these things fit together. But one thing that is, I think, relevant is if we look at the history of statistics in the United States. If we look at, for example, some of the old textbooks on incest, which has turned out to be fairly widespread, you'll find a textbook that was, well reputed at the time that says 1 in 4 million Americans were incest survivors, number one. Bessel van der Kolk, who is one of the leaders in trauma, thought it was very interesting, adding up the numbers, why half of the entire country's incest survivors were turning up in his office. If it was, really so low, we now know the numbers are 100 times higher. But they also said that incest could be viewed as a beneficial thing because it was acclimatizing a woman to the relationship with her husband. And there was actually, no discussion of the harm of incest. And you'd come away with the idea that if a 6-year-old girl had the privilege of being able to have sex with her father, that she would be set for life. Now, I mention that because whether it's childhood abuse statistics, whether it's domestic violence, addiction, we are a country in denial when it comes to, the shadow side of this country. We don't like talking about it. We butter up our history. And so when I see an official number of a little under 600,000 homeless, and then I see other numbers cited in the 2 to 3 million, I err on the side of the higher number. And that's just based on the statistical historical pattern of United States government agencies minimizing trauma and abuse in America. It's a stunning statistic, but the Veterans Administration Agency managed to deny the existence of PTSD for over a decade while escalating and mistreating its veterans coming back with PTSD to such a point that leading researchers who cared about the issue had to leave the VA to go study and make a difference. So this is a meta-conversation about a national pattern of marginalizing, minimizing, deflecting, avoiding, and delaying dealing with issues. And so if we're to learn anything from history, I think you can expect the average American, the average family, the average American government, and any government-funded agencies to err on the side of minimizing, deflecting, ignoring, and even blaming people who survive. We did this with women who brought up sexual abuse cases. blaming them for the way they dressed as opposed to challenging men for not being able to control their own bodies. So we are a very abusive culture in many ways, and we are very committed as a culture to not looking at that abuse. Now, of course, some of that is changing with things like the Me Too movement, but it's good to have that context. Now, one of the other, I think, questions to look at, because it ties in as a meta-conversation, is, there's some question. You'll hear, whether from Tony Robbins or, Jordan Peterson, both of whom I respect, that you want to be careful not to create a culture of victimhood. And, what I see around that is it may not be healthy for one's personal future to create a primary identity around being abused, because then you're locked into that's who I am, as opposed to this is something that happened to me. And there's a little bit of psychological complexity here, because if you don't acknowledge who you are, if you don't acknowledge what happened, you can't integrate it and develop a healthy response. And one of the interesting tensions that I see going on in our culture's denial pattern is that precisely because we are so committed to denying what happened and what's going on, it creates an additional trauma and threat to sanity on the part of our abuse survivors, who have had a very significant trauma in their life, number one, that's being treated as if it never happened, which leaves them to feel like they're going crazy, which means they talk about it more. It's like, I'm not crazy, this did happen. And no, that happens to a lot of people. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying this happened to me. Well, I don't have time to talk about that. Maybe you're exaggerating, maybe this, or it's no big deal, get on. Get on with it. It's like, fine, it happened, no big deal. It's like, no, this has left scars. No, it hasn't, And so it creates this tension where the more an issue is denied, the more it has to be talked about. And so it becomes an identity, in a certain sense, coerced by the denial pattern. And so this is something to be careful of. And it's not something that can be done alone. In other words, if you're in a group of people that is committed to avoiding the issue, so that you have to say something over and over and over again for it to register just a little bit, then you've got a choice. You can either build up a little bit of an identity of saying, I'm the one that keeps saying this over and over again, or one can enter the denial pattern and pretend it doesn't exist, and if it does, it's no big deal, and since it's no big deal, let's not talk about it, and let's certainly not do anything to change our culture at large, because it happens to anyone, and besides, it's no big deal, and maybe it didn't happen anyway, and I'm sure there was a good reason, and so there's all of this. So this is one of the bottlenecks, because if everyone really gets that something is a big deal to someone who experienced a trauma and a crisis, and responds and listens and lets it in, what happens is the person lets go of it, because the circle is owning it. Because these traumas are of an ecological nature. They don't just pop out of nowhere. They emerge systematically and ecologically out of the culture. and they require every one of us to participate to some degree. And when we don't participate in the abuse, and we own that it's a big deal, and we know what we need to change to have that no longer happen in our house, etc., then the abuse stops. Statistically, it stops. And people stop talking about it because it's not happening. And they can go on with their lives and develop another identity. And so there's a way that things resolve if they're owned and honored in a healthy way. And what happens when we are part of an abusive culture is that when these things occurred, like we hear, women or in some cases men talking about abuses 5, 10, 20, 30 years ago. And in many cases, if you examine those cultural frameworks 10, 20, 30 years ago, in some cases you examine the frameworks today, and you find there is not a single person in those contexts who is able and willing to do anything about the abuse. And then you realize, okay, that's why they didn't talk about it. And this is particularly the case when we have situations of actually punishing the victim with shame, where, someone who's abused, etc., we look at things like single parents. So someone takes off and leaves you with a child, and then in a certain way you're punished, you're marginalized, you're one of those people we don't want to be. And again, this is going back a little bit, but it's a pattern of punishing the abuse survivor rather than owning the issue and how we're all a part of it and looking at how we can respond.